Hello and welcome. I'm Suma Katauka and you are watching World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. US President Donald Trump has warned Hamas that it will be eradicated if it violates the Gaza ceasefire agreement, while saying he would give the group a chance to honor the truce. Meanwhile, US Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife Usha have traveled to Israel as envoys. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu amid Israeli accusations that Hamas is stalling on hostage returns and as reports of Israeli attack continues in Gaza. 15 international United Nations staffs have been confined to the UN compound in Sana'a, Yemen by Houthis since Saturday, while 5 local staffs have been released according to UN spokesperson Stephanie Dujarric. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has discussed the detentions with the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Iran and Oman, as 53 other UN staff remain detained by the Houthis, some since 2021. US President Donald Trump and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese have signed a $8.5 billion rare earth minerals deal and confirmed plans for nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS Pact. Both countries will invest over $3 billion in critical minerals projects. Sanae Takaichi has become Japan's first female prime minister, leading the LDP amid political scandals and coalition challenges. She leads a minority government backed by the Nippon Ishin Party and faces the challenge of unifying her party while stabilizing the economy. French President Emmanuel Macron has announced that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will attend a Coalition of the Willing meeting in London on upcoming Friday. The coalition formed by France and Britain in February aims to coordinate defense assistance for Ukraine. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy begins a 5-year prison term today at La Santé prison in Paris for conspiring to raise campaign funds from late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, making him the first French leader jailed since World War II. Colombia has recalled its ambassador from the United States after US President Donald Trump threatened to raise tariffs and called President Petro an illegal drug leader. The move follows US military strikes on alleged drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean that has killed dozens, drawing condemnation from Colombia and human rights groups. Now we start from France. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has arrived at Santé prison in Paris to start a 5-year prison term. Sarkozy, who was the conservative president of France between 2007 and 2012, was sentenced for allegedly conspiring to raise campaign funds from Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Sarkozy's lawyers have already filed an appeal to release him from imprisonment, on the grounds that there is no risk of him repeating the crimes, destroying evidence or pressuring witnesses. They also said that the former French Prime Minister will be in jail for just over a month should the appeal be accepted, and that their first priority is to get him out. Let's listen in.
Au moment où nous parlons, la demande de mise en liberté de Nicolas Sarkozy a été déposée. À partir du moment où il a mis un pied en détention, les critères qui justifient cette détention ne trouvent pas à s'appliquer. On pourrait lui reprocher, on pourrait craindre qu'il ne se présente pas, qu'il ne reste pas à la disposition de la justice. À 9h35, un peu en avance, il était devant la maison d'arrêt pour être incarcéré. Il n'y a pas de risque de renouvellement des faits, pas de risque de destruction de preuves, il n'y a pas de preuves. Pas de risque de pression sur les témoins. Rien ne justifie la première heure de détention. il y est pour un minimum de 3 semaines ou un mois, puisque la Cour d'appel a 2 mois pour statuer sur une demande de mise en liberté, et le délai moyen à la Cour d'appel de Paris, c'est un mois. Donc, en tout état de cause, même si rien ne justifie cette détention, il y est pour un mois. C'est un moment, comme Jean-Michel Darrois le disait, un moment qui est très dur.
Now for this discussion, we welcome Dan Perry. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us again. Good to see you. Dan, looking at this, Sarkozy, he's convicted of the connections to Muammar Gaddafi. What's it look like, and can you tell us more about this conviction?
Well, Sarkozy faces a whole slew of accusations, including influence peddling and other things, but the conviction in question has to do with his campaign almost 20 years ago, receiving significant monies, maybe over millions of euros, from the regime of Muammar Gaddafi, who was at that point trying to rehabilitate himself after his complicity in a Lockerbie bombing, and was trying to himself peddle influence in Europe. This is extremely serious, and obviously it leads to jail sentences, but there are complications because, first of all, the charge is conspiracy and not individual involvement. He theoretically knew about it. It's unclear the degree of his exact involvement. Furthermore, he and his lawyers deny absolutely any wrongdoing. Whether or not that is credible is another question. But the main concern is that the case is not yet played out in the courts. It's still under appeal. And the lower court decided to send him to jail, even though the appeal and his conviction is still pending. That is very unusual, both in France, I think, and in general. A similar case in Israel where Ehud Olmert went to prison. His sentence only began after the Supreme Court rejected his conviction. It rejected his appeal of his conviction. So Sarkozy is, among other things, requesting to be released, if nothing else, merely on those grounds that the appeal is still pending. Moreover, there's a larger issue here because, the idea of throwing former leaders in jail has many facets to it. On the one hand, it projects that no one is above the law. Equality before the law, very important. That institutions are strong. That the executive, meaning the president, or the prime minister in some cases, is beholden to the public, essentially. And this is important in the era where, from the U.S. onward, you have leaders who seem to think they're above the law. And in the case of the U.S., the Supreme Court has actually granted the presidency something close to immunity forever, unlike in France, where it's during the term in office. So that's good. But on the other hand, such cases always raise the suspicion of political vendettas and of a former leader being hounded by the new ones. That, in some people's eyes, is why Lula da Silva ended up in jail in Brazil. I'm not countenancing that conspiracy theory, but some people think that. If Donald Trump were ever actually convicted or jailed in the U.S., seems fantastical, but for sure he would claim it's a witch hunt, and on and on. And this in France is particularly bad because the French political system is in great crisis, as we see in the fact that France also made news just in recent days, in recent weeks, when Le Cornu is unable to establish a government, and yet Sarkozy, rather Macron, reappoints him in what seems like an act of total defiance against Parliament. And there's a reason for this, because the country's ungovernable, because the country's basically made for two blocks. The Republicans and the Socialists were the two blocks, two parties for many, many decades. And that was the essence of the Fifth Republic established by de Gaulle, that the two blocks, one of them controlled Parliament, and the presidency maybe was controlled by the other party, usually not, and somehow this worked. But France now has three blocks, roughly one-third each in public opinion. The right, Macron, center, and the left, they loathe each other. There's no natural alliance. So you're looking at a country which seems to be ungovernable, whose political system is misaligned with its ideological landscape, now facing a former a president thrown in jail under circumstances that are a little bit bizarre because of the ongoing appeal. France is in turmoil.
Yeah. Indeed. And you have partly already then answered my question, but what does this conviction of a former president reveal, a French president reveal about France's state, and how might Sarkozy's imprisonment affect public trust in political institutions and future campaign finance regulations in France?
Well, the clearly good impact is that it becomes very clear the campaign financing is very closely watched, and you know, violations of the law in this realm are very severely punished. That is something that many democracies have wrestled with, and mainly unsuccessfully, because there's so many ways to funnel money into the system indirectly. In the U.S., the political action committees have basically gotten around the attempts to keep big money out of politics, and it's failed because big money right now is all over politics in the U.S. and they control so much of what happens and who can get elected. France is making a stand, and in that regard, it is a little bit of a piece with the European Union in general, sort of leading the world in efforts to regulate our way out of imperfections and chicaneries that are essentially part of human nature. So that bit is good. If Sarkozy were more popular, then I think this could be a little bit more toxic than it actually is in the political system. Imagine again if Trump were thrown in jail, you know, so much of the U.S. would be completely up in arms. Sarkozy became a very unpopular president for reasons to do with his performance. And as a consequence, there isn't a huge outpouring of anger about the weirdnesses in this case, which include, as I say, the fact that the appeal is ongoing, and it's somewhat inexplicable to me why they wouldn't just wait it out. Bottom line, France joins a fairly small group of countries that have thrown their leaders in jail. I mentioned one of them, Israel, and another one, Brazil. There's also a former leader, Park, in South Korea, who was also thrown in jail. But these things are extremely rare. The only other European president I can think of is Silvio Berlusconi, who had his own remarkable career because he was a billionaire who controlled the media in Italy, but he was, towards the end of his career, a bit of a clownish figure. That applies less to Sarkozy, who's more sober and somber to a degree. He is appealing to the courts. Who knows, he might eventually appeal to Macron, which would be a little bit inelegant for him, because Macron does not come from the same political background of the center-right as Sarkozy. And also, the presidency in France, I believe, has the power constitutionally to issue pardons, but it's extremely rare and sort of not a tradition as it is in the U.S. And so the story hasn't played out quite yet, but it certainly is fascinating.
Thank you very much, Dan, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, in a joint statement released by Finland, European leaders, including those from Britain, France, Germany, and Ukraine, have reaffirmed their strong support for U.S. President Donald Trump's efforts to end the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. The leaders called for an immediate halt with the current line of contact serving as the starting point for negotiations. They've also emphasized the need to increase pressure on Russia's economy and defense industry until President Putin is prepared to make peace. An important summit will take place later this week in the European Council and Coalition of the Willing formats to discuss further steps into the ongoing crisis. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Dan Perry. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Dan, for staying with us. Now, how effective is these continuous sanctions and economic and defense pressure to counter or compel Russia to negotiate peace?
I haven't observed that they are very effective at all, for the simple reason that, well, for a number of not so simple reasons. One is that the economic stranglehold that was threatened against Russia from the beginning, from February 2022, has simply not been total. The Russian banking system has not been totally thrown out of SWIFT. Russia continues to be allowed to export oil and gas, less than before, under price caps, yes, but they continue to be able to do it. And even a major Western ally, which is India, has been more or less allowed by the Biden administration to buy significant amounts of oil from Russia, to the point where the proportion of Russian oil that constitutes the oil imports of India is now like many times larger than it was before. And of course, they have markets in the Far East and China. Moreover, Putin has essentially rebuilt his economy to be a war economy that is prepared to withstand the impact of the war for many years going forward. And the nature of his kleptocracy is such that he has been able to buy the loyalty of his entire coterie of military, well, much of his coterie of military and political adjutants. So they may be able to survive unless the West really takes significant action of a nature that would involve also a great disruption of global oil markets and in general global markets. That would involve the West being able to absorb some pain. They haven't really shown that. This statement coming out of Finland seems like a step forward, but in a way it reflects what I believe was at least the unspoken European consensus or Western consensus for a while, which is that the war should freeze at the current lines and negotiations should begin. And then the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean Ukraine has agreed essentially to give up 85 to 90% of the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, and other bits of Ukraine, including Crimea? Ukraine is essentially not currently in control of about 20% of its territory. If we freeze the lines where we currently are, which is what this statement out of Finland says, well, does that mean Ukraine agrees that those territories, which are essentially annexed by Russia by now, remain with Russia? They're going to say no, but the music says yes, basically. And that is doubly so when we see that Donald Trump has essentially told Zelensky that you have to basically forget about those territories. The major frustration on the part of the Europeans, is that Donald Trump's position is completely unpredictable and inconsistent. One day he says Ukraine can recover all its territory. The next day, after talking to Putin, he again is screaming at Zelensky to give up the territory. One day he's going to give Ukraine tomahawks, the next day he's not. It clearly looks like Trump is a non-dependable ally in this regard, and that may be hastening Europe's understanding as well that the war really needs to come to an end because the U.S. Is basically not to be dependent on.
And then lastly, I also wanted to ask your opinion on, how we see these news coming in from Europe about the location if a trilateral or bilateral summit between Putin and Trump or Putin, Trump, and Zelensky were to happen. Some countries in Europe have, of course, been appalled by this idea, and then some have said that this is a step that we must take to end the war. What do you think about the location?
Well, Putin is a wanted war criminal, and wherever he goes in Europe, more or less, he needs to be arrested. That is why the previous summit occurred in Alaska. There are ways around this, The ICC's arrest warrant against Putin can be suspended with not amnesty, but I believe it's called, I forget the name of the clause, but there's a clause in the ICC treaty that enables them to essentially give a foreign leader who's under an arrest warrant a pass, and it can be temporary. So there are ways to get around it. I think it's called Section 8. And indeed, many of Europe's countries have done that for Benjamin Netanyahu at U.S. request. Now, this is an important precedent because the Trump administration demanded of European countries, one after the other, not just Hungary, that they allow Netanyahu this reprieve, even as he flies over their territory, for example, en route to the U.S. Trump can obviously do the same for Putin. It will not be popular, but if it is married to some notion that Putin is easing his position and prepared to compromise, and may be prepared to forswear, for example, any and all claims to Ukraine beyond the 20% that he holds, there will be tremendous pressure, I suspect also from public opinion, that whatever country hosts the summit and in general, that Europe as a whole just do what it can to end the war. The big, enormous question is if Putin is allowed to hold on to 20% of Ukraine as a consequence of Russia's naked and clearly illegal aggression that has no justification conceivable, does that reward such aggression in a way that encourages repeat cases? And what can Europe, for example, do to avoid that narrative from settling in that Putin won the war? And to my mind, since I do believe NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table, and indeed NATO membership for Ukraine isn't as important as it seems, because you can be defended under something similar to Article 5 of NATO, even without being a member of NATO, as indeed Ukraine has been defended. The main thing Europe can do is to fast-track EU membership for Ukraine. And I believe this is actually the more important. Ukraine already has a military that's better than any in Europe. What Ukraine needs is stability, regional institutional guarantees, and the prosperity that will come from membership in the European Union. And that needs to be at a minimum the reward for, 3.5 years of basically standing up for the West in the face of the most naked aggression.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us and sharing that insight throughout our news. That was Dan Perry. He's a political analyst, joined us live from Tel Aviv. Now we move on to our next news. China has responded to a critical minerals agreement signed between the US and Australia. The deal is aimed at reducing Beijing's dominance over essential resources. China's foreign ministry spokesperson has emphasized that global supply chains should be driven by market forces and not geopolitical maneuvering. Beijing has also voiced opposition to the trilateral AUKUS pact involving the US, UK, and Australia, which focuses on nuclear submarine cooperation and advanced military technology. This response follows the announcement that the US and Australia will invest billions to support mineral projects aiming to weaken China's grip on critical supplies used in clean energy and military technology.
全球产供链的形成是市场和企业选择的结果。关键矿产资源国应为保障产业链、供应链的安全稳定发挥积极作用，确保正常的经贸合作。中方已多次就美英澳建立所谓三方安全伙伴关系，推进核潜艇及其他尖端军事技术合作表明立场。我们一贯反对制造阵营对抗，反对加大和扩散风险，加剧军备竞赛。
Now for this discussion, we welcome Charles Thompson. He's an Australian journalist, joins us live from Sydney. Thank you very much, Charles, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, what more can you tell us about any updates on this topic after we talked about it yesterday?
Well, now the two gentlemen have met. That's the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Australia. And I was spot on about the Australian ambassador. He should never have been there. And we even had the Australian Prime Minister laughing at him with everybody in the room. What's so interesting, though, is it's amazing that the Chinese are so public. Normally they do things quietly. And the fact that they've jumped up and down and told everybody that now they're going to control all the rare earth minerals of the world what has it done? Trump or United States and Australia actually signed a deal. And I think both parties are putting in $1 billion up front. Now, people may argue that the Chinese are well advanced with technology and development and everything. But of all the countries in the world, apart from rare earth minerals, Australia has some of the most advanced and cutting-edge practices when it comes to mining. So Australia can very quickly, in my understanding, in the next couple of years, pick up the slack for the rare earth minerals. And now that's got the American government and American finance. And now that everybody in the world realizes that there's a risk if they're going to be always wanting to get their rare earth minerals from China, now everybody's in the game. So it was fascinating dynamics. And of course, Trump also pulled the rabbit out of the hat with China. And he said, whilst he feels he's going to have a meeting with them in Seoul and that everything is going to be hunky-dory and that the Chinese will pull away their threat and everything, he did remind the Chinese publicly that America supplies spare parts for aeroplanes. And if they chose not to, Chinese aeroplanes wouldn't fly. So it's a very, very interesting chess game going forward. And, you know, it's not just Australia and America. Every country, I think, in the world now will have some involvement or some connection with rare earth minerals, including India,
Yes.
in a big way.
Yes, and you know, Charles, you have mentioned that the world is realizing that if you depend on only one country for such critical things, if once they pull the plug, this is what happens. So, what else do you think before or to reach this agreement Australia had in the table?
Okay, no. So, see, Australia has rare earth minerals in the ground. It has very advanced technology in mining and also is a very close partner to the United States. Where the complication will come going forward is not what Australia does in collaboration with the United States, but is the pushback of China. You know, everybody's jumping up and down because Trump's putting tariffs on everybody. But the Chinese are the masters, but they do it quietly. And this is why, once again, I'm just chuffed that they come out publicly and told everybody what they're about to do. So Australia's got a very tricky relationship because, you know, its biggest exports and its biggest export market is China. So it has to be very careful with China too. So, you know, Australia is going to be, once again, between a rock and a hard stone between the United States and China.
Right. Thank you very much, Charles, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we stay in the region. Reactions of world leaders are pouring in as Japan has made history with the appointment of Sanae Takaichi as the country's first female prime minister. The European Union's Ursula von der Leyen has congratulated Takaichi, saying that she looks forward to strengthening the EU-Japan partnership, boosting both security and competitiveness. Meanwhile, Beijing has responded cautiously, calling on Tokyo to respect political commitments on key issues, including history and Taiwan, while expressing hope to advance China-Japan ties. Let's listen into what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson has said.
我们注意到有关选举结果，这是日本的内部事务。中日两国互为近邻，中方在中日关系上的基本立场是一贯明确的。希望日方同中方相向而行，恪守中日4个政治文件各项原则，信守在历史、台湾等重大问题上的政治承诺，维护双边关系政治基础，全面推进中日战略互惠关系。
Now we move on to our next news. South Korea has pledged to work closely with Takaichi's government to maintain positive momentum in bilateral relations. Let's listen into what the South Korean Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lee Jae-wong has said.
네, 우리 정부는 일본의 새 내각과도 긴밀히 소통하며 한일 관계의 긍정적 흐름을 이어가기 위해서 계속 협력할 것입니다. 한일 양국은 격변하는 지정학적 환경과 무역 질서 속에서 유사한 입장을 가진 이웃이자 글로벌 협력 파트너인 만큼 앞으로도 미래 지향적 관계 발전을 위해 양국이 함께 노력해 나가기를 기대합니다.
Now for this discussion, we go back to Charles Thompson. He's an Australian journalist, joins us live from Sydney. Thank you very much, Charles, for staying with us. Now, looking at this significant news, what does Sanai Takaichi as Japan's first female prime minister, and also she elected a female finance minister who also happens to be Japan's first. So what do these signal about changing gender dynamics in Japanese politics, and what challenges might they face in that role?
Oh, instrumentally, they're going to have difficulty. But you know, the current new prime minister, she's a survivor. She's been planning this all her life, and everybody's been trying to stop her. But curiously, when they had a vote on whether the emperor or the king of Japan could be a woman, she voted no. So she's a hard conservative, but she's switched on, and it's going to be very interesting. But she's also not having a majority government. So she's also now had to go into coalition with a small party. So it's going to be, there's a lot of interesting twists and turns over the next few months. It'll be very interesting to see how she interacts when she meets with Donald Trump. And I'm sure the Chinese, of all people, will not be happy. And Japan needs change. So it'll be very interesting if she can bring about that change. And she's an open champion of Margaret Thatcher. So interesting times ahead for Japan.
Charles, on building on that, now looking at the coalition between LDP and right-wing Japan's Innovation Party, how will this reshape Japan's domestic policy agenda, and especially regarding government downsizing and many more?
What's so interesting is she is prepared to spend, and overspend maybe is the word, but this right-wing small party that she's joined together with is even more conservative than she is and doesn't want to overspend. So they'll act as a balancing. But I think they're a couple of votes short in the lower house. So they'll also have to bring in some independents. So she's got a really big challenge ahead of her, because whatever she does, and don't forget, this party's been ruling Japan since the beginning of Japanese politics, or this type of politics in Japan, she's going to have to sit down with her coalition partners. And it was quite extraordinary. The other party that they've been in party with for so many years, I think it's 27 years or something, just dumped them outright. So I commend her that she managed to get this smaller party to come on board. And from what we hear, the smaller party is not demanding any ministries or seats. They also acknowledge that they're a very small party, they're a new party, and they have a lot to learn.
Lastly, yes, like you've said, they ended 26-year coalition, and also going back to the individuals, especially the prime minister who is taking, how do you think these both financial minister and prime minister will move forward, take along their learnings or their political alignments from the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe? They are known to be his juniors, right?
Yes, yes. Oh no, they could become the dream team that Japan desperately needs. There has to be changes made in Japan. There are things fundamentally now causing all sorts of problems for the Japanese people. And these two ladies together are going to form a very, very interesting team. And they may spark the imagination of the Japanese people. It was, everybody was amazed that now Japan has a female prime minister, and now she's gone and doubled that and chosen another female to be the finance minister. So yeah, quite amazing. And look, we only need to look at a country like Italy, which was always in minority governments and always falling. And then a lady took over, and she did brilliantly. And we mustn't forget that their protege, Abe, was also very close and had a very strong bond with India. So I think it's a very positive development for India as well, and also for Australia. When Trump and Albanese were signing that deal for minerals, Japan is also now extra investing in rare earth mining in Australia. So yes, interesting times ahead.
Yes, thank you. I didn't know that. Thank you for connecting those both topics. Thank you. Always great learning from you, Charles Thompson, for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we stay on the topic. Tokyo residents react to Japan's first women Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi. Many praise her as strong against pressure from China, North Korea, and Russia, hoping she will boost Japan's declining economy while working closely with the United States. Some see her as powerful and energetic, expecting improvements in women's rights and working conditions in Japan. Others say change may be limited, cautioning women's status or society will not instantly improve. Her views on immigration are seen by many as common sense rather than harsh, reflecting global trends. Let's listen into what some of them had to say.
やっぱり女性初の総理大臣ということで、女性としてはすごい期待しています。やっぱ女性に寄り添った政策であったりとか、女性がやっぱりちょっとどこか違和感を感じてたり、ちょっと生きづらかった世の中を少しでも良くしてくれると嬉しいなと思っています。
私としては変わらないかなと、首相が誰になろうとあまり変わらないかなと思ってます。女性がなったからって言って女性がどうにかなる。すぐにね、女性中心の社会になるわけでもないですし、
もう例えばこの辺で見れば中国だとかね、北朝鮮だとかロシアみたいな圧力に屈しないで済むのは彼女しかいないだろうと。今までの石破さんじゃ当然話にならないよ。岸田もイコール、菅もダメだったよと。だからもう千載一遇のチャンスだよね。10年のいいことだ。この10年の中で最高の出来を。
That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.